There were more than 10,000 people in the New Orleans Superdome when Hurricane Katrina struck, and many more would arrive in the days that followed. The storm had weakened to a Category 3 by the time it reached the city, but this still meant sustained winds of over 111 miles per hour. By the next morning, 2 holes had appeared in the Superdome's roof, and rain was pouring in. Those who were inside started to climb to the upper levels of the stadium. Over the next few days, people who had left their homes or been rescued by the Cajun Navy were dropped off at the dome, even as conditions worsened. Food and medical supplies were insufficient. Power failed on the first night, and the generator provided light, but little else. The plumbing soon failed, leaving more than 10,000 people with no working toilets or sinks. It took nearly a week for the people in the Superdome to be evacuated, and by then, 6 people had died there. What do you do in the face of this destruction? What do you do after a trauma like this? For lots of people, both those who were inside the Superdome and others throughout the city, their view of their hometown was forever changed. Many left and never returned. Even 16 years later, the population of New Orleans is still below what it was before the hurricane. I visited New Orleans this past week, and we drove past homes and businesses that were just never rebuilt. It made me think of the opening words of Lamentations. Echa, alas, lonely sits the city. Once thronged with people, she has become like a widow. Now, New Orleans is once again thronged with people, don't get me wrong. Even with COVID, the revelers of Bourbon Street are back and the musicians have returned. But still one can hear echoes of that period post-destruction when the city sat desolate as the water drained. These words of lamentation were written after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, which is why they are read each year on Tish B'Av, the mournful day of commemoration for this tragedy, as well as many others which have befallen the Jewish people. Tish B'Av, as I mentioned, will begin tomorrow night at sundown. It is a day for sitting in our sadness. Quite literally, Jews traditionally sit on the floor. We wear black and emulate other Jewish mourning practices, and we fast. All this is designed to help us connect physically to that sense of desolation described in Lamentations, to connect that ancient destruction with our own lives. But we do not need ancient rituals to imagine a lonely, destroyed city. The images in our text describing the leveling of Jerusalem are all too familiar to us in our modern world. There are those in this room who lived in New Orleans, who are among the expatriates after the storm. There may even be those among us who were in the Superdome as the water rose. And there are many of us who saw similar scenes during Harvey and just this week, flooding in Europe. There are those in our community who knew people who died in the Surfside condo collapse. And all of us, every last one, knows the upheaval that the pandemic has caused. Even if we didn't have the rituals of Tish B'Av to remind us of the destruction of the temple, we would know something about the experience of the people who lived through it. It's not just disasters, both natural and man-made. We also know desolation in our own lives. We have lost and mourned. We have broken away. We have been hurt and abandoned. Who among us has not known something of what it is to sit in a desolate city of our lives and cry out, Echa, alas? Tish B'Av calls us to ask, what will we be when the fires have gone out and the waters have receded, when the tears have dried and the wailing has stopped? When the world is turned upside down, how do we continue? Can we continue? The rabbis who saw their world destroyed with the temple had a variety of responses. The Mishnah relates that some were overcome with their depression. Others gave in to violence and con artistry. Many lost their faith. And who can blame them, really? But there were others, at first only a few, who sought a different path. Some found a deeper faith in the face of destruction. Once, Rabbi Akiva was walking with 3 of his friends when they came upon the ruins of the temple. A family of foxes had taken up residence where once the Holy of Holies had stood. All the men wept except Rabbi Akiva, who laughed. "How can you laugh in the face of this tragedy?" they asked angrily. The prophets of God had foretold that the temple would be destroyed and that it would someday be restored, said Akiva. Since I have seen the former prophecy come true, I now have even more faith that the latter will as well. There are those among us who can see pain and tragedy and loss, and it strengthens their faith. They see it as a reminder that God has a plan, mysterious as it might be. But they are the rare ones. Only Akiva amongst his 4 friends found this kind of hope on their walk that day. And he was not more right than his friends, who could do nothing but weep. Another story is told about a group of Jews who after the destruction became ascetics, swearing off meat and wine. Rabbi Yoshua asked them why, and they told him that since meat was burned on the altar in the temple and wine was poured as a libation, they would not drink it or eat it as long as the temple was destroyed. Should you not also swear off bread and fruit and even water, since they were all a part of the temple service too? Yehoshua asked. The people had no reply. Then he gently explained, "My sons, come and listen to me. Not to mourn at all is impossible," he explained, "because the blow has fallen. But to mourn too much is also impossible because it is an unbearable burden. Rather, we should find ways to mourn but also to live. When we stucco a house, we will leave a little patch unpainted for a world that is not yet complete. When we prepare a banquet, we will leave off a dish or two. Wear your jewelry, but do not put on every single item." Yehoshua understood that we do not deny our sadness, but we should endeavor not to be consumed by it either. We find healthy ways to acknowledge it. We mark anniversaries and yahrzeits. We light candles. We even have this one day a year, Tish B'Av, which is designed to be a vessel for our community's saddest memories. It is not only about honoring those memories, but also about containing them, lest they spill over into every day. Do not refrain from remodeling your home or having your feast or wearing your jewelry, says Rabbi Yehoshua, but do not convince yourself that they will wash away your sorrow either. Joy and sadness, we live with both, and each makes the other more precious. There were rabbis that used the destruction as an invitation to creativity. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai saw the destruction was imminent, he had his students sneak him out of Jerusalem in a coffin. He was brought before the Roman general where he bravely argued that at least some of the rabbis should be spared and allowed to go to a town in the Galilee called Yavna. That he wanted to establish a school there. The emperor consented, and Yochanan and his disciples escaped destruction and began to build up the rabbinic academy. Their teaching and learning would eventually become the Mishnah, the basis for Jewish law. Almost everything we know of Judaism today traces its development to that period. Their creativity saved Judaism from the same destruction that befell the temple. Playwright Tony Kushner once wrote, "Tragedy's paradox is that it has a creative aspect. New meaning flows to fill the emptiness hollowed out by devastation." So we can choose to embrace the creativity that can come in the wake of destruction. When I was in New Orleans this week, I drove through the Musicians Village, a project in the 9th Ward started by 2 local sons, Branford Marsalis and Harry Connick Jr. Even before the hurricane, being a musician was unstable work, and local musicians frequently left the city in search of more stable opportunities. The musicians' village was conceived just months after the storm. Built on land purchased from the New Orleans public school system on the site of a demolished junior high school, it was funded through benefit concerts and albums. Local and non-local musicians alike contributed their music. The houses were built by Habitat for Humanity in local styles, but raised above the floodplain to keep them safe from future storms. Now these low-cost housing options make it possible for musicians to stay in the city and help it to thrive. Just as the rabbis reinvented Judaism for their age, projects like the Musicians' Village are reinventing New Orleans for a more stable, vibrant future. But my favorite response to the destruction of the temple came from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai sometime after the founding of Yavna. He and Rabbi Yehoshua were walking, and they passed the ruins of the temple. Yehoshua broke down. He had the strength when he saw those ascetics, but when he was with his colleague, he lost it. He said, "Woe to us that this is destroyed. This was the place where we atoned for our sins." Rabbi Yochanan comforted him and said, "My son, do not be distraught. We still have a means of atonement. It is acts of loving kindness. For the prophet Hosea said, God desires loving kindness, not sacrifice. And by loving kindness, God does not mean burnt offerings, but rather preparing for the bride and helping her to rejoice, accompanying the dead to burial, giving coins to the poor." Yochanan understood that we can turn our tragedies into love, that we can find strength not only in surviving, but in serving others. The greatest act of faith is not to endure pain, but to recognize your pain in the eyes of others and help them to endure. There is a coda to the story about the Superdome. People all over the country were glued to their TVs that week, watching the suffering in New Orleans. One of those people was Chef Jose Andres. But what he saw was not only suffering, he saw also opportunity. What are sports arenas if not facilities designed to serve food to thousands very quickly? He once said that he thinks of them not as places where sports teams play, but as restaurants where the athletes are the dinner entertainment. And thus was born his organization, World Central Kitchen. They travel to disaster zones all over the world and convert spaces, especially sports arenas, into massive soup kitchens for victims. They went to Puerto Rico. They were here in Houston. They have been in Surfside, Florida, serving meals to grieving families and rescue workers alike. Chef Andreas looked at destruction and saw what Rabbi Yochanan saw, an opportunity for creativity and, most importantly, for human kindness. Tish B'Av reminds us that when we face the desolate cities of our lives, it is okay to weep. It is okay to wallow and lament. And it reminds us that when we are done lamenting, we can get up off the floor, we can lift our heads and look to the future, we can find faith and hope and possibility, we can find creativity and community, and most importantly, we can access our kindness. May all the destructions in our lives, big and small, be invitations to loving kindness, to care for our fellow human beings. And in this way, may we find strength in one another. Shabbat Shalom.